Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn about variables and data types. So what are variables? Variables help store a value. So in the previous video, we looked at values like 35, 7, different values that were used in calculation. There are other types of values too that can be used in the Python programs. So variables help store the value, and they are very helpful because once you store, let's say, a value of 35 in a variable, then you can use that variable multiple times in several calculations instead of repeating the number. Now, the variables don't actually hold the value. That's what the second point tries to convey. So when you say a value of 35, that value is stored in memory somewhere. And if you say number equals 35, then the number variable is actually just pointing to that number 35 in memory. It might be a little bit hard to grasp if you are a beginner, brand new to programming, but we'll see more of it as we see examples. But that's what variables are. Just remember that they help store a value. Now, coming to data types, there are different types of data types that Python supports. I've given the list here. So int is the short form for integer. As the name indicates, it stores only integer numbers. And float is short form for floating point, which is nothing but decimal. So you will declare float types to store decimal numbers. Now Boolean is going to be very, very new for you if you're new to programming. So Boolean is just true or false. Those are the two values that can be used. Nothing else can be used. Something can be a true or false, and you can represent that using a Boolean data type. And then finally, string. String is nothing but text, a bunch of characters. So anything that you see on this screen, right, could qualify as a string. Maybe the name variables, that's just a string of characters, right, VAR, and so on and so forth. So string is nothing but text. So you can use all these different data types to do kind of amazing things in Python, and we're going to see some examples of that now. Now let's quickly jump back to terminal. So we're still going to use the Python interactive shell that we saw in the last video, so we can type commands and then see output immediately. So I mentioned the number 35. So if we type 35, Python outputs that immediately. Now you could do something like num equals 35. Now, as you can see, there was no output because we didn't ask Python to do anything but store the value of 35 in num. Now you could type num and Python will say 35 because now Python knows, because we said num equals 35, that's what the value is that's stored in that variable. So num is the variable, and equals might be a little bit puzzling also if you're new, because normally in mathematics we use equals for equality, but in programming equals means you're assigning something. Here we are assigning the value of 35 to num. Now you can do like any type of mathematical operations that we saw in the previous video using num. So you can say num plus 10, so that's 45. But the value of num hasn't changed. So if you type num again, it's 35. So when we did num plus 10, we just increased the value by 10 and then outputted it. But we didn't really change the value of num. There was no equals here, right? Now, if you wanted to change the value of num to 45, then you would do something like num equals num plus 10. Now here, what's going to happen is num will be increased by 10. So 35 plus 10, 45. And then we are assigning that 45 to num. Now if you do num, it's going to say 45. Now there is a shorthand form of typing this. So let's say we wanted to make this 50. So we want to add 5. And we want to save that in num. So you could do num plus equals 5. Now if you type num, it's going to say 50. So it may seem puzzling, but it's just a shorthand way of saying num equals num plus 5. Instead, you can just say num plus equals 5. Now similarly, you can do subtraction, multiplication, division, anything you want. If you are doing the calculation and then you're assigning that to the same variable, you could do the shorthand with any of those operators. Now, so far we've seen only integers, right? So all the numbers we've seen have no decimal points. Now you could do 98.4, for example. So that's a floating point. Python displayed it just like it displayed 35, but in this case, this is a floating point. You can save this also in a variable. Let's say temperature equals 98.4. And then if you type temp, it's going to display that. Now, in the floating point also, you can do all sorts of calculation, whatever you did earlier. So you can do temp plus equals 2. Now, if you do temp, it's going to say 100.4. So it's just that the floating points help save decimals, whereas integer helps save only integer numbers. Now you could do, so as we saw already, you can add an integer to a floating point, right? And you can do the same with variables. So temp plus equals num. So now we're saying 100.4 is temp, and then num is 50. So we're just adding that and then assigning the temp. So temp, now it's 150.4. So you can combine variables like this and do calculations. The end result of a floating point plus an integer is going to be a floating point. And that's what you're seeing here. Now, so we've seen integers, we've seen floating points. The next thing is Boolean. So Boolean is either true, like I said, or false. So you can say is employed equals true. Now you can display it also. Employed is true. Now I could have also saved employed equals false. So we're going to see the significance of Booleans when we look at some other coding structures like if conditions and everything later on. But just for now, remember that Boolean is a data type that can be assigned to a variable, and it can hold only two values, either a true or a false. And finally, we're going to look at string. So strings are like this. Let's say John. So we're saying create a variable name and assign John to it. Now type name, it's going to give you the output back. But notice that we had given double quotes here, but then when Python displayed it, it displayed single quotes. So for Python, it doesn't really matter which code you use. I could have even used a single quote here, but you just have to be consistent. I cannot say, let's say employee name equals John and then double quotes. So it's going to say syntax error. Now this is the first time we're seeing an error. It's called an exception or an error. Python didn't really like it that we combined a single quote and a double quote. Python just wants you to be consistent. I can do, so I already used double quotes here. Let me use a single quote and then save it as Pat. Now this time is okay. Now I can display it too. It's going to display Pat. Python didn't really care that I used a single quote. As long as you're consistent, Python's going to be okay with it. So we've seen integers, we have seen floating points, Boolean, and now string. So these are the key data types in Python. I would really like to encourage you to create new variables, assign values, and see what they're doing, because chances are you're never going to write a Python program without at least one variable in it. So grasping what variables are for and these data types are really crucial. So this is just an introduction to variables and data types, and in the further videos we're going to kind of dive deeper into it. But at this point, like I said, please do create variables and values and different data types so you get really familiar with it. Thank you. See you in the next video.